Hello, so this is Ann Bach coming from you live from Augustana College. This is WOG.FM, Radioactive. So thought I'd give a brief introduction of myself. I am a senior now at Augustana College. Again, this is my first podcast, so I'm super excited to share some great information with you all. Other than that, I am a cello performance major, French minor at Augustana. I'm involved in the Augustana Orchestra here, and other than that, I'm involved with WOG here, doing some awesome podcasts. So I'm super excited to dive into our first podcast here. So with me, I have Jessica Schultz. If you want to give a brief introduction, just say hi and you know who you are, what you do here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Ann. I'm so delighted and to get to be a part of your first podcast. How great. My name is Jessica Schultz. I am an Associate Dean in Academic Affairs here at Augustana. I'm also an Associate Professor of Psychology, so I'm a counseling psychologist by training. And I think probably for our conversation today, we'll be mostly wearing that hat as we talk about psychology and COVID.
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the topics we'd like to bring up today is what PTSD is, so post-traumatic stress disorder, if I'm correct, and then the difference between that and post-traumatic growth, which is not something that is fairly common for people to know about. So I thought we could just introduce and get started by breaking what those two things are down for us.
Yeah, it's a lot of alphabet soup, right?
Yes.
PTSD and PTG.
Yes.
Yeah. So both of those constructs are constructs that happen, experiences that can happen after someone experiences a traumatic event. And so when we experience trauma, we might develop what's called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So often in the media, folks hear about that within the context of veterans, and certainly we have an enormous crisis as we think about the impact of exposure to combat and the trauma of that on veteran mental health, and PTSD is one of those disorders that we can see. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that develops, again, after someone experiences trauma. We actually see that the majority of people who experience trauma do not develop PTSD. And we see some variability based on the type of trauma that is in terms of how many people develop PTSD. But what PTSD is people experience kind of a constellation of symptoms. And so we might see avoidance, and so people after a trauma avoiding the event. So if we take that example of a veteran avoiding things that remind them of the experience, or someone who was in a car accident, avoiding being in a car, avoiding driving, avoiding the place where it happened, sometimes avoiding relationships or connection. We see intrusion as another category of symptoms, and so people will have intrusive memories, maybe intrusive dreams, kind of flashbacks of the event. Those might be images, they might kind of be smells that really trigger those flashbacks. We also see changes in mood or cognition, and so feeling more sadness, perhaps more anger, cognitions, kind of thoughts around it was my fault, even though it was the furthest thing away, right? And then the last constellation of symptoms is around arousal and reactivity. And so within that part of PTSD, someone feeling on guard, a pretty quick startle reflex, sort of always on the lookout, that hyperarousal, maybe difficulty sleeping.
Yep.
And so within PTSD, someone develops those constellation of symptoms to the degree that they're interfering with daily life, right? So for a student, they're not able to function in classes, or maybe socially, or in their workplace, whatever it might be, but it's getting in the way of daily life. So that's really what PTSD is. Now, people might experience trauma and have distress related to it, right? Really struggle. PTSD is really then developing a disorder.
Yeah, and I think it would be a great idea to even first break down what trauma is, because I think there's a stigma around that the event itself is traumatic, and really, kind of dive into what trauma actually is, because it's really a thought that we have of a particular circumstance.
Yeah, and that's such a great question. There's such rich literature around this. Interestingly, so the DSM is the book that contains all of the psychological disorders, so it's a diagnostic and statistical manual. So previous versions used to define trauma as, quote, outside the range of normal human experience.
Okay.
Which then implies this is super rare, right?
Yes.
But actually what the research suggests is more than half of us, depending on the study and how trauma is defined, more than half of us experience at least one traumatic event in our lifetimes. And for, especially for people who are living in poverty, those rates are much higher. Different populations, we see much higher rates, especially within different marginalized populations. So this isn't something that's rare. Trauma is relatively common, unfortunately, right? How it's defined is interesting. I mean, you'll see it defined in a variety of different ways within the literature. What's important about it is that it's the perception of the event versus the actual event, right?
Okay,
And so rather than a car accident, by definition, being a psychological trauma, what's more important about that is did I perceive in that moment that my livelihood, my life was in danger, right? Was of threat, that my well-being, there was a significant threat to my well-being or the well-being of others around. That perception is what really is going to drive how we define a trauma. And so we can see that for the same event, some people might experience it as highly traumatic and others less so, for a variety of reasons, but including how we perceive those events.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think it's thrown out there that we have this idea that no matter what the circumstances, it's just going to be equally as traumatic to someone else. So, and that is not always the case most of the time.
Yeah. And sometimes too, how we use that word of traumatic is hinting at the impact of it, right? Versus just the actual, was this a trauma? How traumatic often gets at like how distressing or how much of an impact is it going to have on the person. And that is not just about the event, but it's about the person's history, their experiences of trauma in the past, their support network, their sort of coping system. There's all sorts of things that play into then the impact that event may or may not have on us.
And that gets me thinking what the difference between, or again, I think this is in correlation with each other, but anxiety and trauma, like how those correlate with each other. Because I think it's so thrown out, like the word traumatic and trauma is thrown into our everyday diction, that we overuse it and then forget the meaning of what it actually is and what the differences are.
Yeah. Isn't there such an interesting balance of normalizing trauma and anxiety, depression, the power of normalizing those and really fighting stigma, but then if they lose their impact and it just becomes that, well, yeah, that exam was traumatic, versus no, that's a different thing, right? That's a stressor, that wasn't traumatic. And in some ways, when we start to overuse it, it loses its power, and so then it really loses its how descriptive it is and how deeply impactful it can be for people who are experiencing anxiety disorders, who are experiencing trauma.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction between the two. Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to post-traumatic growth. So talking a little about what that is and how it's different from PTSD.
Yeah. So post-traumatic growth, if PTSD is really one of the negative sequelae that can come from trauma, post-traumatic growth is the experience that some people have, and in fact the research suggests the majority of people have, after their experience with trauma, and really importantly their struggle with trauma and making sense with it, that they might find benefit from or grow from that experience. Now, really importantly, that's not like trying to put a silver lining on a trauma or to say that the trauma, it was good that it happened. A trauma is never good, right? Yeah. And so I think that's really, really important that we name that and own that this is not saying this is a good, or that trauma is good. Trauma is painful in so many ways. I think it's a statement on the incredible power of people, that many people then after these horrific experiences experience growth or find benefit from them. Not right away, and again, importantly, this is after the struggle with trying to make sense of what happened and how did that happen to me or my community or my loved ones, and what does it mean about the world and my sense in the world and who I am and who I want to be. That a trauma often shatters our beliefs about that, or shatters the ways that we think about those things, and in reconstructing those in the struggle of trying to put those pieces back together, and not just put them back together in the way that they were before, but trying to find new meaning from them, that we might experience growth from that. And when you look at the research around post-traumatic growth, they really sort of the main researchers and the main measure of post-traumatic growth has identified 5 different domains of growth, or 5 different areas that people tend to experience growth, post-traumatic growth in. And as I say these, you're probably going to be thinking about maybe your own experience or people, loved ones who've experienced trauma. So, I mean, let's take the experience of someone who's been diagnosed with breast cancer and struggled through that. The first one is appreciation of life. And so we might hear someone saying something like, each day is precious. I just don't take things for granted anymore. I appreciate life in a different way. And that really has changed their orientation. The second domain is around relationships. I feel closer to my family. I'm much more invested in my relationship, my partnership. I'm so much closer to my kids now. Or I just value relationships more, right? I spend less time on work and more time with the people I care about. The third one is new directions. And so this one, someone says, you know what, I discovered I don't want to be in the corporate world anymore. I want to go back to school and I want to be a nurse. I want to help people in a different way. Or I want to start a nonprofit to really help people who've experienced what I've gone through. And so there's these new directions that might happen in work or education or life outside of those things. The fourth one is in personal strength. And so this growth in one's view of oneself, right? So things like, I realized I'm so much stronger than I thought I was. I realized that I can get through things. That sense of self. And then the last one is in spiritual change and spiritual growth. And so whatever that means for the person, if that's within a religious orientation or a spiritual orientation that's not encompassed within religion, whatever that looks like, but feeling closer to a sense of meaning or purpose, feeling closer to one's God or one's spiritual center, again, whatever that might look like. So we see those different domains of growth, and that growth can happen, and they might happen in multiple of those areas. And there's some interesting research about how that happens and for whom that happens, but it really is this notion that through the struggle, we can experience growth. If I can say one other thing with that, I think what's also really important is sometimes people think that, well, if people who experience growth must not have been impacted as much by the trauma. And actually what we find is that level of distress following the trauma is positively related to post-traumatic growth. So the more distress you feel following the trauma, the greater levels of growth that we tend to see. So again, it's with that struggle in coping with that and making sense with it. It's from that we can sometimes see that growth.
Yeah, and from that list you gave, again, if I'm not wrong, there's no particular order or, for how someone should deal with this growth, or is it up to the individual based on the event? What would you say?
Yeah, in terms of if someone was wanting to pursue
Yes.
post-traumatic growth. Yeah. There's no prescribed way to do this, and it's certainly, we do see that this is a natural phenomenon, and so this is for a lot of people, part of their natural coping process, something that emerges. There are some interventions that have been developed that have been done within the context of therapy or kind of self-help type things that have been shown to promote post-traumatic growth. And most of those are about that sense-making process, that meaning-making process. So things like expressive journaling. We know that people who have greater levels of social support are more likely to develop growth, and really the kind of mechanism for that is using that support network to make sense of, right? Having conversations about what does this mean and how is this impacting me and what do I want to do with it? So that using our social support networks, our friends, our family members, that's an important part of it. Really ruminating or allowing ourselves to really go there and really think through, again, those questions of how is this impacting me first, to then how do I make sense of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And just going off of that, I think there's this view of us, if we, aren't experiencing these thoughts of growth, it's common that we start beating ourselves up because we're like, well, then PTSD isn't bad and I want to experience growth. And so they push it on themselves to experience this growth. And I don't know if you could maybe give us a little bit of information on when you know it's the right time for growth.
Oh, such a good question. Such a good question. Yeah, I might start before the information of a big encouragement for all of us around self-compassion in that, right? In, I think, knowing when we need to reach out for help, but knowing that first part of care for ourselves following a trauma is really in coping with the distress and taking care of ourselves in that way. Post-traumatic growth isn't something that happens overnight, right? It is something that takes time. That time might be months, it might be years. When I was a graduate student, we published a paper on people who had experienced, had gone through a bone marrow transplant, a really rare form of cancer. It was a really invasive procedure that's no longer done. And they were 10 years out from this bone marrow transplant. It was a longitudinal study that we were tracking them over time. And we went back and asked them one last time about their experiences of growth. And what we found was that people were continuing to find benefit from that, right?
Wow.
This is, if we think about what trauma does to us, of really shaking us at our core, it takes us a long time, and maybe the rest of our time, to make sense of that. And so I guess within that information, the encouragement I would give is both self-compassion for ourselves and patience.
Yes.
And also a big encouragement to use our support networks to process, to use journaling if that's something we do to process, or just reflection to be able to really make space. I mean, sometimes in the busyness of life, of school for students, right, of all that you're engaged in, we don't always make space to ask those questions of, what does this mean for me? How am I making sense of it? And those questions aren't one that we're going to answer with one conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
With one journal, right?
Yeah. And I agree with everything you're saying. One other question I thought of is, if you know of someone that has gone through a trauma, or they're experiencing traumatic, what seems like PTSD, what should you do as a friend or family member to help them out, and again, not necessarily be their counselor, but to find them the right help? Like, how would you go about that if you know of someone with PTSD or going through, even post-traumatic growth?
Such a good question. I think most importantly is to be there, to be a support. We know that social support is one of the best things for our mental health. whether that's mental health for all of us or mental health for those of us who might be experiencing a mental illness. So being connected, and what's really important about that social support is that it's social support that's helpful for the other person. And so as you're thinking about supporting people who might be struggling, staying connected, checking in, asking what they need, what's helpful for you right now, and then really listening to that. Because that's going to vary. For some people, what's going to be helpful is to talk. For some people, what's going to be helpful is to go get a Whitey's pumpkin shake. Like,
yes,
that's what's going to be helpful. Sometimes it's going to be to shoot some baskets, right? Like,
yeah.
It's going to be different. So to ask and to really listen about that. I would also really encourage to really normalize help seeking. That one of the things that we can see in, I think, culturally, in conversation, and certainly in the experience of post-traumatic growth, when we were post-traumatic stress disorder, when we were talking about those symptoms, we talked about the likelihood in PTSD, or one of the symptoms, to blame oneself.
Yes.
Feel like it's my fault. And so to give the message that you're not alone, it's not your fault, there's help available, there are options. And when you're looking for options, certainly if you're on campus, the counseling center on campus is a great resource. Psychologytoday.com is a great resource to just search for therapists, and you can actually sort for people who specialize in working with trauma. So that's another really great one. And certainly if folks are using that, you can also sort based on insurance and access to care, and then community mental health centers in folks' local communities are often resources for people who don't have the privilege of insurance and can have access to care on a sliding fee, or different ways of paying. So yeah, as you're thinking about supporting others, staying connecting, asking what they need, and really listening to what they need, giving the message that it's not their fault and that there's help available would be three of the things that I would really encourage.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are really great points. And again, there's always resources at Augustana, outside of Augustana, that again are free with the insurance that we have, correct? So, it's not going to cost anything.
Absolutely. For Augustana students, the Counseling Center is a free resource for you, and they are amazing in providing care and support. You also, Augie students this year have access to a new resource in the Students.care app, and so that's an app you can download on your phone. And within that, students have access to 24/7 counseling, so that is just another awesome resource for
amazing.
Students. It's also a way to access care in languages other than English, and to maybe search for counselors who have expertise that might not, or identities that might not be represented here on campus.
Yeah, absolutely. So going off of that, I know, again, we've mentioned this kind of at the beginning, but with the pandemic going on and coming back to school, again, you get another sense of everyone's experiencing something different. There's some people that are, loving the situation or completely hating it, and they themselves have experienced trauma, whether with someone passing away and coming back to school, or really, it could be any circumstance like we were talking about that can cause trauma in someone's life. So given that we're back to school, what would be some advice that you would give on PTSD or post-traumatic growth for the circumstance that we're in right now?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that the collective traumas that we're experiencing right now certainly might be individual traumas in the way that you were describing, collective traumas about COVID and the impact in our nation and the lives lost, collective trauma around police brutality and racial injustice, and bearing witness to that, and Black Lives Matter movement and movements around racial equality
Yeah.
and what we see about traumas and collective traumas and intergenerational traumas here as well. So this is a time where I think it's really important for us to be mindful of trauma and the impact in our own lives, and the impact of the lives of students, our classmates, our faculty members, the people that we're interacting with in the community, to have as much grace and compassion, and seeking to understand, right? If we go back to your question about how do we support someone that we care about, to be connected, right?
Yeah.
So if that's for us individually in ways that are COVID safe, physically distanced, but to stay as connected as we possibly can, to reach out to our support networks, but also to be the ones reaching out, to really listen, right? To ask those questions of one another. What do you need? How can I support you? I want to understand your experience, and to really listen.
Yeah, I think
to
people
that.
overlook that listening is, I think, the most important thing someone can do for something like this.
Oh gosh, enormous.
Yes.
Absolutely enormous. There's a plaque on my dear friend gave me a plaque years ago. It's on my computer, and it says, "Listen with the ear of your heart."
I love that.
Isn't that great?
Yes, I love that.
If we could all listen more with the ears of our hearts.
Yeah. And it's just listening, and I think just active listening, and knowing that maybe you have nothing to say. It's just simply listening. You don't have to have an opinion or an emotion that comes with what you're hearing. You can just simply listen. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, if we all just took a moment and thought about when we've been in those moments of a lot of pain, how often do we want somebody to problem solve for us and tell us what to do?
Yeah.
That's usually not super helpful. Usually we just want somebody to be there with us.
Yeah.
Right? And when we're the one that's doing the being there with, it's sometimes hard because it feels like, well, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And to really remember that being with, listening, and just being with one another, that's powerful. And those are gifts that we can give one another.
Yeah.
I think also to, in these moments, to really, as much as we can, normalize that there is help available. There are resources available. There is help available. And that reaching out for those is a really brave, awesome thing to do.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
something to be celebrated.
Yeah. That's great. Awesome. So do you have any other, topics that you wanted to share regarding what we were talking about? Or
I think maybe just an encouragement to all of us as we're living through this time again of collective trauma, to be gentle, look out for one another, but I think to act too, right? To engage in those ways. We think again about post-traumatic growth and making sense of this. To think about what we're experiencing, bearing witness to in terms of traumas in our communities and our countries right now, and to ask the question of when we're ready, what is that calling me to do?
And going toward that growth, just being here has been something that I've been trying to improve on. And just doing this, I'm hopefully spreading the word for other people to grow, and that it doesn't have to be a negative circumstance that we're in. It can be a way to grow despite COVID and restrictions. Again, restriction on anything, on any of our lives, is seen as something that it's hard to deal with, because it's constantly on our mind when we wake up and go to sleep each night. Is all the restrictions that we have at school, connections with family outside of school now and with friends, and just socialization. So I think that's really important to think about. So, do you have any recommendations with students that are listening or will listen to this podcast? Any advice that you'd want to give on maybe pursuing that growth and what that might look like? And again, I know it's different for everyone. We talked about that, but maybe just some examples.
Yeah. Certainly right now, I think recognizing that what we were talking about earlier, that the growth happens through the struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And so experiencing the struggle doesn't mean that growth might not happen, right?
Yeah.
Or that something is bad or wrong with you. Not at all, right? That growth happens through the struggle.
Yeah.
I can't emphasize enough to stay connected, to use your support networks, be creative. Holy cow, Augie students, I am so proud of you in the ways that you are in the midst of these restrictions, rocking it, like finding ways to be connected, and really protect physical health. And I think if we can continue to protect physical health and doing all those amazing things that we're all doing, while also really being mindful of protecting our mental health at the same time, I think that's going to be, that to me is one of our next big challenges as the semester evolves. And so really, really being connected, reaching out. We haven't talked about some other practices like mindfulness and gratitude, but there are some really great evidence-based practices that aren't necessarily about post-traumatic growth, but are about just kind of taking care of ourselves. That there's some great resources around. So, and there's certainly all sorts of ways to plug into that don't have to be super time intensive, right? This isn't. I know there's so much on your plates. This can be 10 minutes in the morning or in the evening to really invest in. Just as we're masking up, like gratitude on too, or mindfulness on, or I don't know what that pitch line is, but mask up and connect.
And what's funny is that I took a journalism class and I had to record all the almost like empty time I took just being on my phone uselessly, and that could have been time that I could have been practicing just moments of gratitude and seeking, positive affirmations, or just diving into what my thoughts are for the day. Like, am I having a bad day, or can I change that thought? And, can I make this a positive day for myself? It's really important, I think.
Oh gosh, I think that's huge, right? That is so important, of being mindful of how we're using our time in those little moments. And one of my frustrations, I think it's so awesome that there's a lot more attention and air being given to self-care and wellness. It's great. My frustration is that the strategies that are talked about aren't always evidence-based, or the way that gets framed.
I agree.
Right? And so when we say take some me time, sometimes that translates to me time. For me might be I'm on Instagram scrolling. Well, that's probably one of the worst things I could do for my mental health in those moments. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to be on Instagram scrolling, right? But if I'm struggling and I'm needing to invest in my mental health and wellness, going there is probably not going to be what's really going to be helpful for me. Right? What's really going to be helpful, all those things that you listed off. And so I think as much as we can, being conscious about some of those choices. Again, not that our phones or social media are bad by any means, but they're not going to be effective strategies for boosting our mood.
And that's a great point. And if we were to even dive into the real root of some of the, what our thoughts are kind of giving us when it comes to like scrolling through social media, I think it's something that's overlooked, because everyone goes on social media and there can be either mostly like judgment between themselves and what another person's life looks like, seeing that happiness on someone else and thinking, well, I'm not happy right now. And I think that's really important. Or again, this is what I've been kind of going through, is I've been trying to filter out some things that I know aren't serving me and fixing that. So again, you're right, it could be either a good or bad experience based on how you're thinking of social media. Again, if you're mindlessly going through social media and unconsciously thinking, the thoughts I had mentioned about, she's happy, her life looks like this, or he or she, whoever, I think it's really important to realize that and seek something that maybe is better quality when it comes to self-care, self-me time, what people are saying. And it doesn't always have to be physical. It doesn't have to be like a spa day or a bath. No one has to do like that. That's not always self-care can be getting rid of a negative thought. And if people overlook that, that could be the most powerful thing someone could do. And it's really been powerful to me. Again, I think, like you said, the strategies that people put out, they'll put pictures up of, make sure you include me time, and it's a face mask or something. And I can proudly say I've done like a bath and a face mask, and that hasn't really solved any of my problems when it comes to self-care. So I think really focusing on what we're thinking about a situation is the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And not that those things are bad, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, a great bath, holy cow, that can be so relaxing, right? But in terms of, really getting at what you were talking about.
The root of the problem.
Other strategies might be more effective there. And maybe that's an area, not maybe, but I do think that's an area that psychologists and others have work to do to share what are those strategies. I mean, I think sometimes businesses and companies have taken over the self-care.
Yep.
And it's become an industry that you have to like buy your self-care.
Yep, absolutely. And that it's a privilege almost.
Yeah. And a lot of these strategies are low cost, but they are effortful, right? They're not easy. It's so much easier to do some of those mindless things. And sometimes we need those too, right? Like we just need to check out the strategies that are going to be helpful for us are ones that are likely to be more intentional. They're going to pay off. But they are effortful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say one of the hardest things was to take a step back and realize that I wasn't being as mindful as I thought when it came to having alone time or me time. And I thought, just like you said, mindlessly scrolling through something just to get my mind off of homework or a stressful situation turned into just hours of mindlessly doing other things to then distract myself instead of getting to the root of the problem and fixing those thoughts so I could be more productive in what I was doing physically. I think that's really important.
Yeah. And even if when we're engaged in mindless activities, if they can be less stimulating activities, right? Like a mindless walk in the woods or in Lincoln Park, like, holy cow, how restorative that can be. Or a just mindless bath. That isn't on our phones or isn't with those stimulations. Like, those can be recharging.
Just being
ways.
Curious that there are other options other than mindlessly or mindfully scrolling through Instagram, finding something, or a social media website. There's other options, and I think it's really important for people to be curious about all the options that they do have when it comes to being mindful and self-care, and that it doesn't have to cost anything.
I like that. Being curious and open.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you so much. This was honestly the best pleasure. Thank you so much for for being here today. Sorry.
Thank you. What a delight to get to talk. And just, so much encouragement as we live through this really, really difficult time together.
Yeah, and I think this was a great topic, just given what's going on right now. I'm really excited for everyone to listen. All right, so this was WOG.FM Radioactive. Thank you for having me.